I knocked on my brother's door at midnight with nothing in my pocket. He said, "I cannot help you right now." I slept in my car. 1 year later, he knocked on my door and I opened it and said, "Come in." There are moments in a man's life that divide everything cleanly into before and after. Standing at your brother's door at midnight with empty pockets and a car that smelled like fast food wrappers and regret is one of those moments. What happened next is the other one. Welcome back to True Revenge Stories. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. You are going to love it here. My name is Sylvester Marchand. I am 52 years old. I have been an independent electrical contractor in Trois-Rivières, Quebec, for going on 19 years. I rewire old houses and stubborn commercial buildings, and the occasional barn that has no business still standing. I am not a wealthy man, but I am a capable one. My hands know what they are doing, even when the rest of me does not. My wife Renee says I can fix anything with a wire and a prayer. She is mostly right. The prayer part I have started to lean on more heavily in recent years. Before I tell you what I did next, tell me where you are watching this from. Drop it in the comments. I would genuinely like to know. Life before the hard year was ordinary, in the way that ordinary is actually a gift you do not recognize until it is gone. I had my work. I had Renee. I had my truck and my tools and a small apartment on Rue des Forges that smelled like coffee every morning because Renee made the real kind, not the pod kind, and she will fight anyone who says the pod kind is acceptable. Then the job slowed down. Then the truck needed an engine. Then a client I had carried on credit for 4 months disappeared without paying $26,000 he owed me. In the space of about 8 weeks, I went from stable to hollow. The kind of hollow that sits in your chest and does not move. My brother Donovan is 5 years older than me. He lives in a house in Brossard that he owns outright. He drives a truck newer than mine was even when mine was new. He has a pension and a second income from a rental property and a wife named Sylvie, who decorates for every season, including ones I do not believe qualify as seasons. I have seen a scarecrow on their porch in July. I asked Donovan about it once. He said Sylvie calls it late summer harvest. I said nothing. There are hills you do not die on. We were not close in the way some brothers are close, but we were brothers. We had the same parents. We grew up in the same house. We ate at the same table. I thought that meant something when it mattered. I thought that was what it was supposed to mean. The night I drove to Brossard, it was February. Not a gentle February, a Quebec February. That means it personally. I had $14 in my wallet and a quarter tank of gas and no plan beyond getting to Donovan's door and saying I need help. I had never said those words to anyone in my adult life. The drive was 45 minutes and I rehearsed the whole way. I knocked at 12:17 in the morning. I know the time because I checked my phone before I knocked. I do not know why I checked. Maybe because some part of me wanted to remember it exactly. Donovan answered in his housecoat. He looked at me. He looked at the car behind me. He looked back at me. I said, "Donovan, I am in trouble. Real trouble. I need somewhere to sleep and a few days to get my footing." He stood in the doorway with the warm light of his house behind him, and he said, "I cannot help you right now, Sylvester. This is not a good time." I said, "It is midnight in February. I have $14. He said, "I understand that, but right now is not good for us." I stood there for a moment. I want to be honest with you about what that felt like. It felt like something settling. Not breaking, not shattering, just settling into a new position that I understood would be permanent. Like a bone that heals wrong. Functional, but changed. I said, "Okay, Donovan, I hear you." I drove to a parking lot off Boulevard des Forges, and I slept in my car with my coat over me and the engine off because I needed the gas. It was 19 that night. I know because I checked my phone again at 3 in the morning when I woke up cold and could not get back to sleep. I called my friend Roland Beaupré the next morning at 7. Roland has been my friend since we were 22 years old working on the same job site outside Shawinigan. He answered on the second ring the way he always answers, which is immediately and without ceremony. He said, "Sylvester, what is wrong?" I told him everything. The client, the money, the truck, the door. Donovan in his housecoat at 19. Roland was quiet for 4 full seconds. With Roland, silence is a form of speech. Then he said, "Get in your car and drive to my house right now." I said, "Roland, it is 7 in the morning." He said, "I know what time it is. I have been awake since 5. Louise made cinnamon rolls. Get in the car." I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Sylvester, I have known you for 30 years. Drive." I drove to Roland's house in Cap de la Madeleine. Louise fed me and did not ask a single question until I had eaten. That is the mark of a genuinely good person. She waited until I had 2 cinnamon rolls and a full cup of coffee. And then she said, "Okay, tell us." I stayed with Roland and Louise for 11 days. In that time, Roland co-signed a short-term loan that helped me recover the immediate pressure. He said, "Do not thank me. Fix the business. That is all the thanks I need." I did. If you have made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. I spent the next year in the quiet kind of work that nobody sees. I restructured how I invoiced. I stopped carrying clients on credit without a written contract and a 30% deposit. I hired a part-time bookkeeper named Claudette who found $11,000 in unbilled work in my first month of files and looked at me the way a doctor looks at someone who has been eating badly for decades. She said, "Sylvester." I said, "I know, Claudette." She said, "No." I said, "I know." I also found a lawyer named Isabelle Fontaine who had the energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed recovering money and the manner of a woman who had heard every excuse a debtor ever invented and found all of them equally unimpressive. She went after the client who had disappeared with my $26,000. He had not disappeared very far. He had simply moved to Drummondville and hoped I would give up. Isabelle did not give up. In September, she called me and said, "Sylvester, you have a check." I said, "How much?" She said, "All of it plus interest plus her fees." In October, I put a down payment on a small house on Rue Bella. Nothing grand, 3 bedrooms, a yard, a garage for my tools. Renee walked through it twice before she said yes. The second time, she opened every closet. I did not ask why. Some things you just let happen. We moved in on the first weekend of November. Renee hung curtains the same day. I assembled furniture until midnight. It was a good midnight, the kind where you are tired, but it is the right kind of tired. Donovan knocked on my door on a Saturday in late January, exactly 1 year and 11 days after the February night in the parking lot. I know because I had not forgotten the date. I do not think I was ever going to forget the date. I opened the door, and there he was. He looked smaller than I remembered, not physically, just around the edges. He was holding his hat in both hands, the way men hold things when they are trying to appear humble and not entirely sure they deserve to be. He said, "Sylvester." I said, "Donovan." He said, "Things have gotten difficult." His rental property had gone badly. His tenant had stopped paying and caused significant damage, and the legal costs had eaten through what he thought were his savings. Sylvie's car needed replacing. He was behind on 2 payments, and the pension would not cover the shortfall for another 4 months. I stood in the doorway and I looked at him. I said, "Donovan, come inside." Renee appeared from the kitchen. She looked at him. She looked at me. She said, "I will make coffee," and went back to the kitchen without another word. She is a formidable woman. I have always found that remarkable. I sat Donovan down at my kitchen table. I poured him coffee. I sat across from him and I said, "I need to say one thing before we talk about anything else." He said, "Okay." I said, "I was at your door at midnight in February. $14 in my wallet, and you told me this is not a good time." He was quiet. I said, "I slept in my car that night. I want you to know that, not for your guilt, just because it happened, and it is part of what we are now. I needed you to have heard me say it at least once." He said, because I am going to help you. Not because that night does not matter. It does. But because you are my brother and I know what it feels like to be where you are sitting, and I will not do to you what you did to me. That is not who I want to be." He looked at the table for a long time. Then he looked up and his eyes were wet, and he said, "I do not deserve that." I said, "Probably not, but here we are." I helped Donovan. Not immediately and not without terms, I wrote down clearly with Isabel's guidance. A repayment structure, a timeline, specific and honest. He signed it. He did not argue about a single line. If you have made it this far, do us one quick favor. Subscribe. A lot of people watch without ever doing it, but it costs you nothing and means everything to us. Thank you genuinely. The situation with Donovan resolved slowly the way real things do. By spring, he was steady. We did not become different people overnight. Brothers who have hurt each other do not simply reset, but we are something now. Careful and honest and maybe more real than we were before. When it was easier to assume things would always be fine. Because they had always seemed fine. Roland came over for dinner in March. He sat at my table and ate René's tourtière and told a story about a job in Victoriaville that went badly in a way that was only funny in retrospect. René laughed until she had to set down her fork. At the end of the night, Roland stood in my garage doorway looking at my tools hung neatly on the pegboard, and he said, "You organized that yourself?" I said, "I did." He said, "It looks like a man who has his life together." I said, "Roland, I hung some tools on a wall." He said, "I know what I said." He drove home at 10 nay. I stood in the garage for a minute after the taillights disappeared. The garage smelled like sawdust and old oil, and something that might have been contentment if I am allowed to use that word without making it strange. I turned off the light and went inside. René was already in bed reading. She did not look up when I came in. She just moved her feet to make room and said, "Close the window, it is cold." I closed the window. She turned a page. That was enough.